People who have heard deathbed confessions. What were some interesting ones? My grandfather admitted to me, and only me, that he accidentally had sex with a man. My dad had Alzheimer's and ended up in a secure ward. He was blind and almost deaf. I was visiting him one day. He didn't know who I was, but he started talking about me. He said I had done better than him in life, and that he was proud of me. He was a quiet man in real life, and never told me that when I was growing up. Looking back, he did things that my dumbass never realized were for me. Like when he retired, his colleagues asked what he'd like as a present. He chose a scientific calculator. This was back in the 1970s. He had no use for it. He gave it to me for university. I thought he was just passing it on, not realizing that he'd asked for it with me in mind. My grandpa, a Sicilian man with blessed cooking skills, told us on his deathbed that his meatballs were actually frozen meatballs from the grocery store. My great-grandmother lived a very long and interesting life. She was in her 20s in the Great Depression. She had a wild streak from those days that we don't know much about, to the point that we actually don't know our great-grandfather's name. Just the husband she took later. Over the course of her nearly 100-year life, she had collected owls. Literally thousands of owl figurines. She had clocks, wall hangings, pot holders, lamps, stained glass art, salt shakers, and more little figurines than you could imagine, all depicting owls. We all wondered the importance of the owls. She never talked about them, we just all knew she loved owls. Well, when she was nearing death, at the age of 98 or 99, and the docs said she had days, my grandparents went and talked to her, and they asked her if she had anything she wanted to share or ask before she goes. She thought for a moment, then said, "I never understood the owls." It turns out she didn't really give a shit about owls, near as we could piece together sometime in the 40s or 50s perhaps. She bought either a trivet or a set of salt pepper shakers that were owls. Then someone got her the other. Those were the oldest owls anyone could remember, but from there, someone got her an owl to match, probably a pot holder or placemat, and all of a sudden her kitchen was owl-themed. From there it snowballed. The owls flowed like wine, baffling her for 60 years, eventually taking over as the bulk of her personal belongings. My grandma confessed to murder on her deathbed. Usually you'd think it was the pain relief, but she was such an eccentric it was actually believable. We traced all her ex-husbands, partners, and any other likely candidates, and fortunately no one was missing or died an untimely death, but sometimes I wonder. Not my story, but that of a hospice worker who spoke to my class. For those who don't know, hospice is a method of end-of-life care that focuses on alleviating the emotional physical pain of a dying person to ease their passing rather than combating their imminent death. One of her patients was a bed-bound woman in her 90s who was generally unresponsive but had flashes of recognition engagement. It's hard to gauge the level to which unresponsive patients are detached from their surroundings, so they encourage family members to keep their company in hopes of soothing the patient. Now this patient was from a U.S. state that prided itself on its state university and the university's football team. The woman's family had attended this university for 4 or 5 generations. During her hospice care, however, her great-granddaughter was the first in their family to decide to go to a different school, the rival state's university. In fact, her family was supportive of her decision, but often joked about her being the rebel or Judas, or what have you. One day they were all sitting around the woman's bedside, teasing the girl about her decision. Suddenly the patient sat up, looked at her great-granddaughter, said, "Traitor," and left our world. When I was in hospital, the guy in the bed next to me just asked to stop taking his meds as he was ready to die. Last thing I heard him say was, "There's no one waiting for me at home, so I'm going where they are." Wasn't really a shocking confession, just a lonely and heartbreaking one. My time to shine: I worked at a hospital in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, a small town near Munich, for the last 14 years. My job there is not fancy at all. I move people around, throw the trash out, and occasionally I take care of some handy like work, fix a leaking showerhead, and stuff like that. As you can imagine, I get to see a lot of patients that come and go. Some of them pass away, such as life, I guess. I remember a few instances of people confessing to me their biggest regrets. Here are some examples. An old Polish woman told me that she regretted not fucking Hitler when she had the chance. Her words. I wanted to ask her about more context, but I was afraid to be honest. Another notable example was an old truck driver that used to work for an Eastern Germany company. He told me that he once run over some kids with his truck and was too afraid to stop and check if they were okay. Once another Polish lady told me that she used to be a prostitute during Second World War and that she slept with very high-up people in the government. She told me that she did not regret that part of her life, but that she could not tell anyone, and that was a heavy emotional drag. She also told me that she aborted more. My grandfather had pretty terrible dementia, and he kept making deathbed confessions as he knew he didn't have much time left. They were often about witnessing a murder and not telling anyone, but each time he confessed to us, the details changed. It happened a couple of times a day over the course of his final week. We finally figured out that he would watch the local news and hear about these things happening, then would think he had actually witnessed them. I didn't see it, but my aunt watched her elderly mother fall down the stairs and confess just before she died that she wasn't her biological mother. She told my aunt that her oldest sister was actually her mother. The sister had gotten pregnant too young and the mom said it was hers. A common way of handling it back then. She revealed it in her very last breath. Not a deathbed confession, but the last conversation I had with my grandfather has always stuck with me. He had Parkinson's and lived on a farm outside of town. One day he looked at me and said, "I'm getting too old to take care of Mom, my grandmother. I need you to do that for me, okay? Okay." His health deteriorated pretty rapidly from that point onward. I still call my grandmother every single day and try to get back home whenever I can to help out around the farm. My great-uncle actually confessed to having 2 illegitimate sons right before he kicked the bucket in front of his own children and grandchildren. The crazy thing was that none of his children knew this life of his. Not even my great-aunt knew about it because she would have made a huge fuss if she was alive at that time and knew about it. What was crazier was that these 2 sons already passed away 5 and 7 years ahead of him respectively. He was 98 years old and his invisible sons were 65 and 69 years old. The children found out one of his invisible sons actually was a teacher at a school that his granddaughters attended when they were in high school. Nevertheless, his children decided to reach out to the children of his invisible sons. They got connected and learned more stuff about my granduncle. The craziest thing was that I actually dated one of the granddaughters of one of the invisible sons. The one passed away at the age of 69 years old. Talking about a few degrees of separation. Not a deathbed confession exactly. I was a hospice volunteer and worked with a man with a brain tumor. He was in pretty shape except for that. He was going nuts in the nursing home, and one day I took him for a ride around town. He had grown up there. Seemed like every other block he would point at an old building and say, "Used to be a brothel there, empty lot, used to be a building there, and it had a pretty good whorehouse there. There was a whore there until it burned down." We passed by this old odd-looking apartment building that had more doors than it should have, and it appeared some of them were sealed up. He said, "That used to be a crib and each door had a small room behind it, and each brothel worker had her own room." We passed under a railroad bridge, and he pointed a flat area, and there used to be black woman that ran the best brothel in the state right there. I finally laughed and said, "Guess I know what you spent your youth doing." Mother ran a nursing home growing up. From ages 5 to 10, I spent every weekend with residents. Because I was a kid, residents often confessed stuff they thought I wouldn't understand. Two stick out. One funny, one not. Women was dying, maybe about 96. Even had her last burst of energy life where she thought she was better. This is common. A black delivery man came with some flowers. After he left, she looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "I can't believe I'm dying without having been with a colored man." Second one was while I was reading Bible verses to a resident. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to drop that baby in the well." This wasn't a deathbed confession, but more of hospice. This man was an alcoholic. This isn't usually a problem because when in hospice you can get whatever you want as long as it is legal, but he was a violent drunk and was forbidden alcohol as a result. Anyways, between his requests for alcohol, he talked about how he and a friend got into a massive fight about land and his equipment being borrowed. As a result, they haven't spoken in 20 years. He said he didn't even know why it was such a big deal and regretted being that aggressive. Basically said he missed his best friend and wished they didn't lose all those years. I wasn't there to witness her confession, but the story leading up to it is intriguing. My mom was adopted, and my grandparents never kept it a secret. They loved my mom like their own. When she was growing up, she tried to find out as much as she could about her and her adopted brother's birth parents. Back in those days, though, info like that wasn't exactly the easiest to find. My mom and uncle were brought to the orphanage with little to info on each of their biological parents, or was elsewise requested to be kept secret. Eventually, my mom found enough info from notes she had gathered, like which families might have been most likely to be related to her, some property info one can find at the library, and she just sort of pieced this puzzle together over her life. At a certain point, she was able to get the names of her mother and her brother's mother. She was able to find out she was part of a big family, with lots of brothers and sisters. But for my uncle, he found out that his mother had died not long after placing him for adoption. By the time she had gathered all of this info and found this much out, my mom was married, had my older sister, and was pregnant with me. I can't remember exactly what it was she found that led to it, or if she heard something from someone, but she got a phone number. That phone number went to the house of her biological mother. She called, and the voice of a young boy answered. My mom asked for the name she knew and she hears, "Yeah, 1 second. Hey mom, phone's for you." My mom and her mom talk. It wasn't an easy conversation, and I'm just gonna refer to my mom's mom as bio-grandma from here. Bio-grandma is not comfortable with my mom contacting her, at all. She doesn't ask my mom a lot of questions, but my mom says that she was just gonna talk, and if bio-grandma wanted to hang up at any point, she could. My mom just gave her a short version of the story of her life, and then the conversation was over. Bio-grandma after that would send letters to my mom on occasion, but bio-grandma made a point of telling my mom she could never be found out by the rest of her family. And bio-grandma carried that secret with her until the day of her death. One of her daughters asked her, "Will you tell us where you went when you went away that time?" And bio-grandma finally confessed she had gone to a home for unwed mothers all those years ago to have my mom, the child of her affair. I've met 2 of my bio-aunts, and sadly both of them passed a few years ago. But dang. Not a confession but a denial and solid information that helped us clear a few pending matters. I worked for a federal law enforcement agency. We covered major felonies, some of which relate to organized crime. Not mafia per se, but open-ended criminal enterprises. We had a mid-level player as an open-ended suspect for a string of cargo thefts, robberies, etc. Knew him for years. Arrested him several times. He taunted us a fair bit. Lung cancer got hold of him before we could build a solid case. Things went downhill fast. Went to see him at home, just before he transferred to hospice. That he did at least 50% of what we suspected is an open secret. I knew it. He knew it. For whatever reason, chose to give me a break. He said, "If I give you something, will you sit on it for a few weeks initially?" I could not agree. What if he was going to leak info about something in progress, etc.? He assured me that it could wait. I agreed. "So," he said, "I know that you are looking at me for the thing. I didn't do it." He admitted wanting to do it, told me who was responsible, and where we could find solid evidence to implicate 5 to 6 people. "Why did he tell me?" said the other guy. "Never treated anybody right, did not ask him to elaborate." I moved on the info about 3 weeks later, after the informant died. Never had to share info source because he pointed us to substantial corroborating info. My great-aunt passed away a couple of years ago. She was suffering from viral encephalitis and fluctuated in and out of consciousness. It was truly painful to watch. Although a lot of family tended to be around her in those last days, I once happened to be alone with her when she made some fairly odd remarks which I kept to myself since. On the day in question, I was playing games on my phone in her hospital room when she started to audibly mutter to herself. It became more urgent and intense eventually. She explicitly called me to her side. Her eyes looked huge and confused. I doubt she knew who I was. She spat out her words, most of which were barely comprehensible, putting particular emphasis on boy and ingredient. I sat there for 15 minutes, listening to her erratic account of, as I finally gathered, how she sometimes used to cook eggs in the urine of a stable boy instead of water. She insisted that he was handsomely compensated for his services, but now and then she started to cry and couldn't stop. I googled this weeks later, and there indeed exists a traditional dish in China described in the West as virgin boy egg. Apparently this concept had fascinated her, and she frequently recreated this herself and served it to her family, which sometimes included my younger self without explaining what it was. I am not sure if she felt shame or enthusiasm about this. She often stammered something about the secret ingredient, but it quite obviously haunted her towards the very end of her life. I worked as a night janitor in the children's cancer ward at my local hospital. There was a little boy, about 6 years old, laying in bed, and he called me into his room because he wanted help adjusting his pillow. He was hooked up with wires and stuff, so he couldn't roll over to place the pillow how he wanted. Figuring I'd be allowed to do it since a nurse wasn't really needed for it, I parked my cart outside of the room and went in. In the room, he started asking me different questions about my job. The first being if I was a nurse. I said no. He asked me if I had seen his mom in the hallway and told me that she'd gone down to the cafeteria to get him strawberry milk and a donut. I said no to that too. He was quiet for a second. Then he looked me right in the face and said, "If I pass away soon, I hope that my mom is not sad." That hit me. Like really, really hard. This kid was 100% aware that he could leave this world and his mother would be affected by it. I didn't even know how to feel, so I told him that he wasn't going to pass away and hundreds of people survive cancer, which is a big number to someone that young. I left shortly after and broke down crying in the bathroom. A few days later, I was wiping down the wooden support railings along the walls of that hallway and his room was closed for cleaning and disinfection. That sign is only hung outside of rooms when someone passes away.